Okay, everybody, we're going to kick off now. So thank you very much for joining us. For those that don't know me, I'm Chris Green. I'm one of the team here at Retcon at Greenfield Computer Club. I'm also the guy behind the Amiga User Group Kickstart. And you know, for my sins, I've been a computer journalist for far too many decades. Joining me today for our chat is Roland Perry. Now, Roland is an iconic figure, quite frankly, in the British computer scene. Father of the Amstrad CPC, very much at the coalface at Amstrad during that incredible period of technology innovation, both for home and business computing, that really very much reshaped the home computer landscape in the 80s and going into the 90s. So Roland, thank you very much for joining us today. Oh. There we go.
Oh. Aha. We have sound. Jolly good.
So Roland, the first thing I wanted to ask you today, and I'm sure it's the question you've been asked many times. I mean, you were working at Amstrad at a very interesting time in the early to mid 1980s, when Amstrad decided to get into the home computer space. For a company that had traditionally been in the more mainstream, high-volume consumer electronics, what prompted the move into home computing, and how hard a sell was that internally to get Alan's buy-in or anybody else's buy-in to going into the computer business?
Well, as a company, Amstrad dealt in a wide range of consumer electronics, whether it's hi-fi systems, CB radios, and so on and so forth. And every year they had what they called a blockbuster product. So a brand new product, which was something they'd never done before. And the idea was to put it into the shops sometime around October, November, and people would then buy it for Christmas. And that particular year, their blockbuster product was going to be a home computer. And it had been in the works for about 2 years by the time it appeared in the shops. And they kind of did it backwards. What most computer designers did in those days was to design a motherboard, get it working on the bench, and then think, oh dear, we need a box to put it in. And a lot of the people, the electronics engineers and the software engineers, weren't terribly good at designing boxes, particularly injection molded plastic boxes, which is quite a difficult thing to do. Countless PCs almost literally just failed because they couldn't find a box to put it in or couldn't manufacture a box to put it in. So Amstrad had already done that when our paths crossed, and what they needed was the motherboard to put inside this box which already existed. They'd hired a couple of guys to design a motherboard, and unfortunately they bit off more than they could chew, and eventually had to say, we're awfully sorry, we can't do this. But that really wasn't good enough for Amstrad because they'd already decided they wanted this product that year. So one of the jobs I had at the time, as if you like an external consultant, was what I call project rescue. So if somebody had a electronic thing which they couldn't quite get working, or they wanted fettling up a bit, they come to me and my colleagues at Ambit, and we'd do that, and then they'd go off and put it into production. And we'd already done some work for Amstrad on a couple of years before, probably on the CB radio, and I think also on a hi-fi system. So they just naturally said, oh, let's ask Roland and William, who's my partner in crime at Ambit, let's ask them if they could get this computer working for us. Well, along with quite a few of my friends at the time, we'd always wanted to design a home computer. And in fact, I'd built one myself 4 or 5 years before then, but there was only one of them, and it worked perfectly well. But I was never had no ambitions to actually market it and sell it and manufacture it. But I'd also been working as a bit of a freelance journalist, so I'd written reviews of all the machines as they came out. So I'd written reviews of Spectrums, I'd written a review of the BBC Micro, another one at the time was a thing called an Auric, which you may have heard of. So I'd already kind of examined all these computers in quite detail, and So when the chance came along to design one from scratch, I knew, if you like, what other people had done, the bits that worked okay, the bits that could have been done better. And so I gathered a little team of people together, and we produced the motherboard design in about 4 months, which is absolutely unprecedented. Normally that would take about a year. And the only way we could do that was by hiring people who'd already done something very similar before. So we weren't starting from scratch. And so that's how I got into it. Amstrad's aim at the time was to sell 200,000 that Christmas, which, you know, doesn't sound like very many today, because Apple probably sell 200,000 iPhones the first day it comes out. But in those days, 200,000 sounded like an awful lot. And we weren't convinced they were actually going to sell that many. But it didn't matter to us, because we were just the design. We'd been paid to do the designing. And it turns out, of course, that it was sufficiently successful. I think it sold about 3 million. One of the things people keep asking me is, well, how many of this machine did you make, and how many of that machine were sold? And the thing is, I just don't know, because I was working in the design development department. Things like that were being done by the manufacturing, marketing and sales people, and they just never bothered to tell us. They never came back and said, oh, that computer, we sold 500,000 of those, jolly good, or, oh, that was a bit of a flop, we only sold 5,000 of those. They just simply never bothered to tell us. And I wasn't that inquisitive, so I didn't really want to know. So there's lots of figures in the literature which are, I'm not sure there's any records left, because the Amstrad company itself was dissolved about 10 years ago, and they weren't that interested in keeping an archive of documentation and things. So I think putting, you know, lots of sources together, I think we probably did about 3 million CPCs, about 8 million PCWs, which is the word processor on that table there.
I mean, that's plausible, I would say, yeah. I mean, yeah, 3 million, 8 million, I think it's plausible.
And then we had, they went on to do PC clones. And we had at one point in the kind of, by the end of the first year of the PC clone, we had something like 25% of the European market in PC clones. But I couldn't turn that into a number, and I'd have to go and look it up. So that's how we got into it, and it was kind of like a set of revolving doors all the time. You were working on one product. The previous one was in the shops. And then the one before that was perhaps getting a bit long in the tooth and out of date. And probably a fourth one, which wasn't the one you were working on this week, but the one you were thinking about working on next week. So we always had lots and lots of projects on the go.
But I think you touched on some interesting points there. And I think one is that initial sort of, I suppose, strategic aim at Amstrad, which was having that Christmas blockbuster product. Which, you know, it's one thing when you're doing that with a hi-fi or a double-decker video, or, you know, some of those other consumer electronics products that Amstrad at that point was well known for. But of course, moving into the computer space is slightly different, because, you know, arguably, I suppose you could at that point have just done a one-and-done machine and left the community to it, but generally the ones that succeeded were the ones that had a degree of infrastructure behind it. And Amstrad, to be fair, did end up putting that infrastructure behind it with Amsoft and having a pipeline of games coming to market and additional resources and accessories and all that. So it became a fully featured platform, not just, you know, this week's computer, and then, you know, 3 months later you moved on to making another hi-fi. And I think that in itself was quite interesting, because, you know, I suppose to us on the outside, it represented a bit of a step change for the company in terms of its approach to market. Would you agree?
Well, to a certain extent. I mean, the project ended up taking much more of our time than we expected it to. I remember I initially quoted, I think, to do 20 hours a week for a couple of months, and then wind it down to 10 hours a week, and so on and so forth, and ended up working 80 hours a week almost from the day after. But what you've got to remember is Amstrad's customers are not the public. Amstrad's customers are Dixons and Boots and Rumbelows. And the sales department particularly would always be doing, if you like, research and talking to the customers, the big shops, the big chains, and saying, well, which of your products are selling well at the moment? You know, do you think it'd be an idea if we did one of those? And so Boots had the Spectrum in it. Dixon's probably had Commodore 64s.
Yep.
The BBC Micro was gaining quite a lot of traction, mainly through the BBC programmes about it, although they didn't sell a huge number of them outside of the educational sector. I mean, there are lots of people who are very excited about the BBC Micro, and it's good, you know, it's a good enough machine, a bit expensive, but they didn't actually sell a huge number of them. So,
And most of what they did sell went into education.
pardon?
I said most of what they did sell went into the education
lot
space.
Lot of it went into the education sector, and then they tinkered around with, can't remember what it's called now, the small one.
The Electron.
Electron, yeah. So, and that, I think they had all sorts of manufacturing issues with that.
That's right.
And missed the Christmas as it was going to go in for. So, yes, you just talk to your customers, and then later on, of course, when we did the PCW word processor, that's becoming more of a business machine. So we were talking to the office equipment retailers and whatever, and then when we brought out the PC clone, even more so, you're then talking to a different set of customers, distributors for PCs. And in those days, that was when some of the bigger out-of-town office equipment retailers were beginning to open up shop. And so you just go to them and say, well, we're thinking about making another computer. What would you like it to be? And then they'd tell us, and we'd say, well, we can do that, and we can't do that. And then we'd spend 6 months banging it all together, and 3 or 4 months after that, then they'd be arriving in containers.
Good. Now, I do want to talk about, especially about the PCW for a bit, but before I do that, I've got one more question on the CPC. And just to provide context, so when the 464 launched down at Rumbelows on the Edgware Road, I was there.
Oh, right.
I actually lived round the corner. It's where I grew up. And knowing it was coming, I badgered my parents incessantly that I wanted this computer, particularly because, for me, the big selling point for me, and which actually also finally convinced my parents to buy it, was the fact that it came with a monitor, and so wouldn't hog what at the time was the only TV in the house. And I loved that idea, and eventually, you know, the practicalities of it were sold on my parents, although they did make one condition, which was they agreed to buy me the computer, but I had to have the green screen monitor. I know, they were cruel, evil people. But my question ultimately is this. You were going to market at the time against some established players in the market, which was the Commodore 64, the ZX Spectrum, arguably to an extent the BBC and things like that. But these were all machines that were either designed for or capable of using existing displays, because at the time, you know, monitors, TVs were expensive. You know, we were still usually a one TV home. But Amstrad very much broke the mold by being the first home computer maker to sell a fully bundled solution. How much cost did that actually add to the package? And how much consideration was given to actually just selling the 464 as just a keyboard?
Well, I don't think we ever sold it as just a keyboard. I think France, later on when it was distributed in France, they may have sold a few as just a keyboard.
They sold them as just a keyboard with the modulator.
Yeah, that's right. But I think the idea was all Amstrad products tended to be sort of plug and play, and it had to be everything you wanted all in one go. So, and what's more, as you said, a lot of homes only had one television, so you don't want to get in a fight over, is Mum going to watch Coronation Street, are you going to play your video game? So, and one mains plug as well.
Yes.
Okay, so it's just part of the, part of the DNA of the company that they wanted something that was all complete and ready to go. And we also, if you look at the all of the series of computers in those days, it wasn't just the computer and monitor. It had a welcome tape. It had a demo which
That's
you
right.
could run in the shops. You could take it home, plug it in, and do something with it, even if that's only just watching the welcome tape, or on the PCW printing out a sample letter or whatever. So it was very important that it kind of justified itself from day one.
Now, obviously, as we know, the 464 was a huge success for Amstrad. It was then followed up briefly by the 664 and then, of course, the 6128, which saw the platform really move into disk drives and I suppose a much broader range of home computing that was more than just games. It was productivity software as well, which then neatly takes us on to the PCW, the next piece in the puzzle, and really which took Amstrad into the small business world. Again, what was the thinking? What were the objectives behind building the PCW, and how much did you take from the CPC experience when trying to come up with that one?
The hardware design for the PCW is actually very similar to a machine that never happened, which was called the Arnold No. 2, or ANT. So we were already designing effectively a souped-up 6128, and that would have come out if we'd had enough time to do the project. But we got overwhelmed with all the work that we had to do, and something had to get the chop, and that's the one that got the chop. But even before the PCW started being designed, we'd already got something that did 90% of what the motherboard does already. The idea was that it was an appliance, okay? And we took a very hard line at the beginning and said, this is not a computer, this is a typewriter replacement. And you're going to take it home, you're going to plug it in, and you're going to write letters on it. You're not going to play games on it because it's not a computer. You're not going to run a spreadsheet on it because it's not a computer. So we said, the original idea was it was only a word processor. And in fact, we were not planning originally on telling anybody how it worked inside, because that would take so much of our time. So people we could foresee that there'd be people lining up saying, well, how can we write a game for this? And we'd say, well, you're not supposed to write games for it. And they'd say, well, it's got a Z80 in it, you must be able to play games on it. And I'd say, well, there's probably a computer inside your vacuum cleaner, but you can't play games on your vacuum cleaner. So eventually we relented, because so many people said to us that, in the later phases of development, they said, well, surely you can run CPM on this, which we had on the 6128. So we very reluctantly just had a little project to produce CPM for the PCW, which of course we bundled with it and shipped it. There was quite a rollover actually of small business software. Sage was one of the bigger suppliers at the time, and quite a rollover of software from the 6128 to the PCW. So that was kind of already in progress.
And that use of CPM and the fact that it then almost unlocked that huge sort of global library of CPM applications must have helped as well, because again it meant the PCW appeared on the scene with already quite a healthy potential library of applications that could be easily repurposed to run on it.
Well, that's right. I mean, it did. It did work out eventually, but that wasn't the original brief. The original brief was, no, it's just a typewriter replacement. And in fact, Schneider in Germany sold it as a CPM machine that also came with some word processing software, which actually annoyed headquarters quite a lot, because we saw it the other way around.
Actually, that's a good point. And that relationship with Schneider, I mean, how well did that work? Because it always did seem that the German market was always going off on a bit of a tangent from what was happening in the UK and arguably in France as well with these machines.
Well, we hadn't sold many machines in France, or much Amstrad stuff in France prior to the CPC, and we didn't have a distributor in France, so we actually had to set up Amstrad France to distribute it for us. But we'd had a relationship with Schneider for years and years, so whenever Amstrad produced a new blockbuster product, we always got hold of Schneider and said, well, would you like to badge this Schneider and sell it in Germany? And then they do all the work in Germany for that.
But what I'm saying is, yes, we know that the relationship between Amstrad and Schneider was transcended just the computers, but it was always interesting to see that, the way that Schneider marketed both the CPC and the PCW was always very, very different to how they were marketed by Amstrad in, say, for example, the UK. Was that ever a point of contention or concern, the fact that, they were going their own path almost with the machines?
Well, I think we just, we didn't actually care that much. If Schneider came along and said, here's an order for 200,000 computers, we'd say, okay, we'll ship them to you, pay us the money, we'll ship them to you, and how you sell them is your business. Because, this was 40 years ago, and there was very little overlap between the markets, or information even, between the UK and France and Spain and whatever. We were all in our little silos, never talked to one, and the consumers wouldn't see a Schneider machine in the shop when they're on holiday in Germany and come back and try and buy an English version, because people just didn't do that.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of overlap between the UK and the USA, because traditionally so many of the computer designs had come from like the Apple II and the Commodore 64 and whatever. So there was more cross-fertilisation between the USA and the UK markets rather than the UK and Europe. I don't think we'd even joined the EU by then.
No, I don't think we had at that point, no. It was pre-Maastricht. Okay. Now, you talked a little bit about how some of the DNA in the PCW came from that next generation CPC that never was. Well, we have to talk about the CPC next generation that did end up coming to market in the form of the Plus machines. What was your view on that, and what involvement did you actually have in the Plus project, if any?
Well, you've got to remember that I was kind of project manager for all these products, but I had a team of, well, by then probably 15 people working for me, and I just delegated responsibility for products out to those people. I wasn't terribly interested in the later. I wasn't really interested in the Spectrums or even the consoles, but we had a lot of our customers saying to us, when are you going to produce a games console machine or cartridge machine? When are you going to produce and we'd say, well, we don't want to do one of those. We don't think the numbers add up. Yeah. And they'd say, oh, go on, please make one. So eventually we said, oh, okay then, we'll make a cartridge machine. My involvement in that project was almost entirely in sourcing a copy protection scheme for the cartridges. So I wasn't involved in the game, the software development for it, or the migration of the CPC compatibility across to the new machine. That was my various staff doing that for me.
Well, look, we'll move on there for a moment. I think we talked a lot about your involvement in Amstrad. I think what would be very interesting to talk about is kind of what you did next. So, after the Amstrad stuff sort of came to an end, what did you do after you moved on from Amstrad?
Well, I was always interested in communications, online bulletin boards, online services, and I was always pressuring for the Amstrad machines to at least have an optional serial interface so you could plug a modem in. And in fact, the machine I've got on the table there is an extremely early PCW, but it's got a much later serial interface plugged into it.
Oh, right.
So I was much more interested in playing with modems and going online and whatever. So when I left Amstrad, most of my work was involved in online systems. I started dabbling around in mobile phone technology, and you know, it kind of went off in that direction. Now that was before the internet was famous.
Yes.
Okay, so I've probably been doing that 4 years before actually the internet became a thing. So everybody then changed direction. Rather than doing proprietary online services like AOL and CompuServe and whatever, everyone decided they'd do internet-based applications and use the internet for their comms. Now that's good in a sense because it means that you don't have to have your own set of modems. So AOL had rooms full of modems and only AOL customers could dial into them, and CompuServe had rooms full of modems and only CompuServe customers could dial in. Whereas once you've got the internet, all you have to do is stick a server on the internet and tell people to go off and buy an internet access account from someone like Demon or BTnet. So that kind of changed the emphasis and, you know, what was being done. The unfortunate thing, in a sense, was, although it all worked out in the end, for about the first 2 or 3 years, the user interfaces on a internet system were much worse than the proprietary systems. So I think AOL probably had the most whizzy interface on it. And it was some time before either AOL brought out a internet app or other people brought out apps which produced as good a user experience as you could get from AOL.
Okay. Well, look, there's probably a good time at this point to open it up to the floor, and if there's any questions from the audience. Great, we've got the first couple there. We got anybody with a... Yeah, so chap there in the blue shirt, and then the gentleman in the front next. Thank you.
Cool. Yeah, you said there was a company before you got involved with the CPC, and they turned around and said they couldn't do it. How far had they got with their solution, and how close to their solution was the final thing that we got?
Okay. I think it's very noisy here. I can hardly hear you. But I think what you're saying is how far had Amstrad got before we got involved in the project? Yeah, okay. Well, they'd designed the keyboard. They'd designed the monitors, and they knew what shape the motherboard had to be, and they hired a couple of guys to do a motherboard. Somebody asked me the other day online, actually, someone on Facebook, I think, said, did you think of doing an MSX machine instead? Well, the answer to that is, it would have taken us far too long to take an MSX platform and if you like, shoehorn it onto a motherboard that would then fit in the box that we already had. There's all sorts of other technical reasons as well. It was just a complete non-starter. Now, what might have happened is that Amstrad might have decided about 2 years before it was in the shops to buy an MSX box, an MSX clone, and I know they looked at Apple II clones. There were a lot of Apple II clones in Hong Kong, which is where they had an office. But eventually they decided, no, they'd rather have something which was their design and that they owned. They say it could almost have been I think, probably more likely an Apple II clone than an MSX. Because at that time, MSX actually didn't work terribly well, and Microsoft was a really difficult company to do business with. So it would probably have taken you 6 months to negotiate a software license for MSX from them. And that's, again, a complete non-starter.
Next question. So, gentleman at the front there.
As time wore on, consoles and computers started using external speakers, and with consoles they were using television speakers. So, as the CPC was always designed to be sold as a package with the monitor, did you ever consider moving the speakers into the monitor?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think there was an external sound system that you plugged onto the expansion board, but which probably gave you slightly more complex and richer sounds. But no, there was never any idea to put the speakers in the monitor. Apart from anything else, it would have been yet another cable to plug between the two. And we'd already got 12 volts and 5 volts and the video. So if you put the speakers in there, that would have been a fourth cable, and that's just getting a bit too complicated, really.
I mean, that's actually an interesting point you made there. I mean, the Amstrad always had, I thought, you know, I'm coming this from a user perspective, it was always quite handy that the Amstrad from day one always had that 3.5mm audio out jack. So you always had the option of putting your own speakers on. Because I agree, the little built-in speaker was obviously never up to much snuff. And I always used to have a pair of PC speakers plugged into mine. Later on, when I did get my 464 Plus, of course, the CM14 monitor that came with that did have built-in speakers, but as well as having the 3.5mm jack. But you know, I still ended up finding myself using external speakers far more often. And I did have that add-on sound system for my 464 that plugged on the expansion bay, with two speakers that came with it, which looked suspiciously like they'd come out of a car. Next question. Gentlemen.
Hi. There's a bunch of games that are named after you. Do you have a favourite?
I think the question's about games named after me, or the...
I think favourite game on the PCW, I think it was particularly, yes?
Sorry?
Sorry? Put his mic. We get his mic.
Games like Roland in the Cave.
Oh, the 464 games, right.
Yeah. Well, I think it was obvious from looking at the market that there were several series of games that had a little animated character, whether it was a Pac-Man or a Mario or whatever. So it made sense to have a theme. We converted, or companies like Indiscom, for example, in Spain, they converted games that were already in existence over to the Amstrad format, and they all had little men in them, and or little animals and strange creatures and things like that. And it's entirely Lord Sugar's idea that he said, well, we need a series of games. What are we going to call this little animated character? Oh, we'll call it Roland. He's always hopping up and down and all the rest of it. So everyone just kind of agreed and said, yeah, okay. So we didn't have to invent a kind of like an absolutely new brand. They just got sort of almost accidentally named after me.
Let's get the mic.
Do you have a favourite?
My favourite game is probably Roland in Time, which is the one with the kind of the Doctor Who homage in it. And strangely enough, about 18 months ago, there was an episode of Doctor Who which had a CPC as the... it was the episode that had...
it was the remote control for the TARDIS, wasn't it?
Remote control. So it was the one that the TARDIS sort of landed in a tree next to Isaac Newton.
That's the one, yeah.
So yeah, that's so it's kind of gone full circle there. And actually, and we never asked the BBC if we could use their music. We just did it anyway.
Look, it just goes to show that, you know, even Time Lords from Gallifrey knew which was the right computer to buy during the 8-bit era. Gentleman there in the pink shirt.
Hi Roland, what are your thoughts on the collaboration with Sega for the Mega PC, and could that have been more successful perhaps? Do you think it was the collaboration with Sega for Mega PC, was that a good thing or not, and could that have been done better?
Well, I know very little about the Mega PC. I think it was, I think I know who's responsible for it. It was one of the salesmen, and he'd come back from one of the distributors or come back from Dixon's or something and said, well, we really need a 16-bit games computer. Why don't we just license the Sega electronics and stick it in with a box? But I think I'd probably left the company by then.
Okay. Any more questions? Oh, gentleman at the back there in the Atari shirt. We won't hold that against you.
Thanks. When you were designing the CPC, obviously you had a very tight timescale, and obviously the form factor was already decided as well. Had you had more time and maybe a different form factor, is there something you think would have been really good to put in the CPC that you just didn't have time for, couldn't afford, etc.?
Okay. Well, I think the thing that I would do is put an 8-bit printer port on it. Because at the moment, as designed, it had a 7-bit printer port. So you have 7 bits of data and 1 strobe, which of course fits neatly on the peripheral chip, which has got 8 output bits. And actually, it's not that much of a disadvantage, because you can send an escape code to the printer and say, right, here comes the first half of a complicated character, and here comes the second half. But it caused quite a lot of, I won't say bad feeling at the time, but everyone said, well, couldn't you have just saved us all this effort by making it an 8-bit printer port? But we'd have had to find a bit somewhere else to waggle the strobe. I don't know if there was another spare bit anywhere inside the computer that we could have wired up for that. I also wanted to put a speech synthesis chip in it, but that was ruled out because it was just too expensive.
Any more questions? We've got time for one more if there's another question from the floor.
They're all speechless.
They're all stunned by today's revelations. Well, look, I think we can probably wrap it up there. Roland Perry, I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out today to join us and for answering our questions today. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. We will be back at the top of the hour at 2 o'clock for the next talk. Oh, before we actually have a special announcement. Roland, if I could just ask you to say. So, a little birdie told me that there might be quite a special day coming up on Monday. And as you know, we have quite a large Amstrad showing here today at Retcon. And so we've got a little something for you, Roland, to celebrate your special day on Monday. Here we go. Happy birthday, dear Roland. Happy birthday to you. Hooray! 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 Thank you very much indeed. Great. If anybody would like some of Roland's birthday cake, we'll have it on the 2 tables over there. Please make your way over. Thank you very much. As I said, we'll be back here for the next talk at 2 o'clock.